All right, thank you. Welcome everyone. Have a happy Sunday ahead because this is going to be a very important part of it. We are going to be talking about a very important subject to Baha'is, the art and science of reading, Shoghi Effendi. Now, this week's presenter is Bahiyyih Nakhjavani. Bahiyyih Nakhjavani is a reader, writer, and lover of the English language. She is presenting a summary this week of her contributions to a 3-year course held in Acuto, Italy, between 2005 and 2008, under the auspices of the Consulars and National Spiritual Assemblies of Europe. This week's topic, again, the art and science of reading Shoghi Effendi. The course was aimed at inspiring a group of 90 youth to study the writings of Shoghi Effendi and deepen in the covenant in order to become defenders of the cause. Mr. Ali Nakhjavani gave talks each morning and answered questions in the afternoon that were collected in the 3 books now available online, entitled Towards World Order, Shoghi Effendi, author of Teaching Plans, and The Power and Range of His Pen. Mrs. Nakhjavani shared wonderfully inspiring stories in the evenings about several hands of the cause and exciting adventures in her years as a pioneer in Africa. And Bahiyyih gave a series of introductory presentations followed by workshops, which offered the youth from multiple linguistic backgrounds with tools for discovering the hidden anatomy and exploring the beauty of Shoghi Effendi's sentence structures. She will be sharing some of these reading tools with us during the course of the presentation this week. That being said, thank you so much for joining us. We are ready. Jeremiah? Yes? The PowerPoint? All right, where it go?
Great. Do I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to just acknowledge the presence I noticed very briefly in the list of names of some of the precious friends from Italy who know all about this course, and particularly the Robiati family and the Yusefian family, both of whom were involved very much in inviting my dear parents to come and give this course and gave me this incredible privilege of being part of it. So it's just wonderful to feel that you are there, and please excuse me for repeating what you already probably have heard me say far too many times. I want to just begin very briefly with an overview, if I may, just so that you know what this is all about. Or maybe I should follow the model that Shoghi Effendi has given us of telling you what it's not about, so that you start off by, through a process of deduction, to know that I am not trying to do certain things. I really hope that it will be clear to you that I really have no intention of giving you some kind of perfect method that everybody should follow. Maybe we can start, therefore, Jeremiah, with my first page of context to give you some idea of the aim of this little presentation. You know, there is so much that Shoghi Effendi has given us. The sentences in the multiple works that he has written are in themselves so huge that we sometimes get overwhelmed, you know, when we look at his work. My father did a most extraordinary summary, and it's on the first page of the context. He basically calculated the statistics of the works written by Shoghi Effendi. He called them items, and I'll go into that in a minute, but there are some 11,345 items, if you can believe it, that Shoghi Effendi actually produced. 12,308 in Persian and Arabic, and then we've got the cables, and a grand total, just look at that, of 24,102 items written by our beloved guardian. Now, of course, what that entails is a huge variety of things, a great diversity of works, and I tried to summarize them there. We've got the translations, we've got the sacred histories, we've got the great messages and commentaries and major statements of Shoghi Effendi, like the World Order letters. And we've got just ordinary letters, both to national and local assemblies, as well as individuals. He wrote over 24,000 of such documents have been left to us as a legacy by the Guardian. And what do they cover? What are they? What do they consist of? I tried to summarize them also in that little third block. Their analyses of world conditions, their explanations of some of the verities of the faith. He has given us these sweeping commentaries about the past, about the future. You remember the subtitle of God Passes By is retrospective and prospective. It's that ability he had to see time in great panoramas of it. And then, of course, very particular, very precise instructions about Baha'i administration, response to very specific questions that individuals as well as institutions asked. And then, of course, his warnings, his cautionary statements, his guidance, his exhortations, his appeals. And this huge bulk of work is really such an ocean in itself that personally I found that the only way I could approach it was step by step through the sentences. Now, what I want to do today is introduce you to a few tools for how to read those sentences, because those tools give us some idea of the scope of this huge wealth of legacy that he gave us. And before I get into it, that last list there is really what I was saying, what this is not. I hope you don't go away from this little hour that we spend together thinking that I've given you a kind of prescription for how to read, and that you absolutely have to read Shoghi Effendi the way I'm suggesting. God forbid, God forbid. I really don't want you to think that this method that I'm suggesting is that you have to slavishly follow it. There are any number of ways to read. And this is just one way that I want to share with you, just because I find that it could be stimulating, that it could be a way to approach what is really quite a challenge. Those of you that have heard me before know that I have my favorite sort of hallmark sentence of Shoghi Effendi's, which when I had the whole week, as we did in Akuto, when we had the whole week to go through, so that I had the privilege of talking to the youth every single day, I generally started with this one sentence, which I apologize to those of you who've heard me say it before, but it does summarize how we feel when we look at some of those enormous sentences of Shoghi Effendi that fill half a page. Do you remember that marvelous sentence which starts, all we can reasonably venture to attempt is to strive to obtain a glimpse of the first streaks of the promised dawn, which must, in the fullness of time, chase away the gloom that has encircled humanity. I always get the feeling that when we approach some of Shoghi Effendi's sentences, all we can reasonably venture to attempt is to strive to understand the vocabulary, grasp the grammar, begin to understand how the words get put together, in order to catch a glimpse of the first streaks of what it is he's actually telling us, the meaning of the thing. Once we have grasped that, it's as if we've reached the top of a mountain and it chases away the gloom that has encircled humanity. I hope that in the course of this hour, you'll get a moment where you are somewhere on halfway up the mountain with me at least. I'm going to end this first page by reading something which, excuse me, Jeremiah, I didn't put on it. So I'm going to read it to you. It comes from a really interesting collection of essays by Joan Didion. And I'm just going to read it to you aloud so that you'll understand why we're doing this little experiment. She says, to shift the structure of a sentence alters the meaning of that sentence as definitively and inflexibly as the position of a camera alters the meaning of the object photographed. Many people know about camera angles now, but not so many know about sentences. The arrangement of the words matters. You know, we've been hearing a lot recently in current affairs about how words matter and how words set a tone and how words influence people and distort reality and create expectations and all the rest of it. But it's not just that words matter, it's the arrangement of the words also that matter. And I will be talking about that arrangement in the course of today. Now, before we finish all my provisos, I want, if it's possible, dear Jeremiah, to turn to page 2 of my second section that I want to give you. And on page 2 of the second piece of paper that I shared, that's page 1, you go down. At the bottom of that page, there's a little proviso. I want you to remember what I just said about those 24,102 items of Shoghi Effendi. All the sentences that are in those 24,102 items. And remember that while he was doing that, it should also be borne in mind that as he was translating this literature in these circumstances, he was literally doing all these other things at the same time, building the Shrine of the Bab, acquiring properties and overseeing the architectural designs of temples across the world, as well as institutions at the World Center, expanding and developing the gardens at the holy places, confronting covenant breakers, protecting the faith from attacks, strengthening contacts with government officials, and meeting with and encouraging a flood of pilgrims. This remarkable man, Shoghi Effendi, was actually doing all of that in addition to writing all of these translations, these sacred histories, these major statements, these letters and cables filled with extraordinary sentences that we're going to experience. On the first page of that second paper that I shared with you, what I've also done here, and I'm certainly not going to read this, so please don't get nervous about the print there being so small. I wanted to also create a context for you, and any of you that want this are most welcome to borrow, to use this. I did a quick summary on one page because I thought it would be easier to do that, of what was also happening at the time when Shoghi Effendi was writing those 24,102 items. This is a very brief chronology going from the moment of the beginning of his ministry as a guardian all the way down to his death from 1921 until 1957. I've tried to highlight here the extraordinary events of the 20th century. Shoghi Effendi became the guardian in the aftermath of a horrendous war that had been considered the war to end all wars, and that had climaxed, or rather reached its nadir, in an appalling treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, which laid the seeds, of course, of consequent wars of the 20th century. It was at a time when large portions of the world were suffering from that major pandemic of influenza, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. That's when he became the guardian. He witnessed the aftermath of the war. He witnessed the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. With the insight that he had, you can imagine how much he would have understood the devastating consequences of that. And he witnessed the influenza epidemic. And then all the way through the 20s, he was aware of what was going on. He witnessed the collapse of the economy with the Wall Street crash. He witnessed the Great Depression. He witnessed the rise of fascism all the way through from the late 20s through to the early 30s, culminating, of course, in catastrophic events like Mussolini in Italy, Stalin getting more and more of a grip in the Soviet Union, and the rise of the National Social Party, the Socialist Party in Germany, and Nazism. He witnessed the terrifying consequences of that, which affected all of Europe with the Second World War. He witnessed the aftermath of the Second World War with those movements towards independence, the collapse of the First World War with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, leading to the land grab of the colonies all over the place, particularly in the Middle East, which laid the dragon teeth of disaster, which we are still witnessing today. He saw all that. And at the end of his life, he saw, after the Korean War, he was aware, of course, of the devastating consequences of the arms race and the Cold War. It was during that period that he wrote his remarkable works. And that on that page, I've written that because I thought that it would be very important for us when we read the sentences of Shoghi Effendi to realize the context in which he was writing and how that affected also his vision. I don't want to linger on it too long because it's dense, it's tiny print, and I don't want to bore you with it. But if you look at it just generally, you'll see at what times he wrote some of the most important of his works, okay? The Dawnbreakers in the early 30s, think of it. Just at that time when, just at the aftermath of the Depression and the rise of fascism, his most important dispensation of Baha'u'llah, which he described as being the equivalent of his will. And that was in the mid-30s, just at the time when Nazism was getting more and more powerful. Then we've got the Gleanings, the unfoldment of world civilization, the advent of divine justice on the very eve of the Second World War. And finally, the most important really in some ways is 1944, 100 years after the beginning of the Baha'i era. We have his God Passes By, his wonderful gift to the Baha'i world, which gave us that vision of a whole 100 years. I won't linger any longer on that, and we can go past this now to number, which was it? Number 4. Well, number 4 for me, the physics of Shoghi Effendi's style, if you don't mind, Jeremiah. And there I will now finally come to what I thought would be a useful summary. No, it's the page before. It's the page before that starts the physics of Shoghi Effendi's style. Sorry. That's right. This is where the science comes in. I called it physics, and I mentioned the word science because Shoghi Effendi's structure, sentence structure, is architectural. And there are certain sort of elements, almost like laws of physics, that he seems to follow. And I thought it would be helpful to just give you a quick summary. What I'm going to do with you today is just number 1. I'm not going to do the rest. But in the course that we had in Akuto, it was possible to go through all these different ways of analyzing how Shoghi Effendi structured his sentences. I called the first the dialectic method because it's the use of oppositional concepts. It's binaries. It's, in physics, a sort of cantilever principle. So you put the weight on one and then it bends and pushes it against the other. That I call the dialectic method, and in the next sort of half hour, 45 minutes, I'm going to go deep into that with a couple of sentences that we can see how he does that. But I wanted you to have an overview of just a summary of some of the other ways in which he writes. It's not all with the dialectic method. Shoghi Effendi also used, and I've mentioned it already, the deductive method, when he defines something by what it is not. And he uses kind of negations in order to affirm. It's absolutely fascinating because it's both very much the scientific method of experimentation and finding out by process of deduction what a thing is. But it's also very mystical, because that's in some ways the only ways we will ever understand the source of our being, is by recognizing through our own limitations. And it's a very profound sort of concept. Shoghi Effendi actually used that as a construct for how he built his sentences, the deductive method. Then he sometimes uses in his sentences the mass and weight of enumeration. And this enumerative counting method is very characteristic of Shoghi Effendi's style. I'm sure you all know where and when he's done that. I recently was narrating some of his messages, and the messages, especially during the 10-year crusade, where he literally lists every single country and every single island and every single goal. You get this sense of enormous weight, and it's almost incantatory. Again, it's a scientific concept of statistical analysis and counting and listing, but it's also got a quality of music to it and an incantation to it, which is fascinating. So that I call enumeration. Then there's something else he does in his style, and this is particularly the case in his translations of the writings of Baha'u'llah and the Bab, but particularly, of course, Baha'u'llah. We have his gleanings and other of his great works in the Book of Certitude and the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, in all the letters to the kings. Especially in prayers and meditations, Shoghi Effendi uses what I call circumlocution. He walks around, just as we walk around the Haram al-Aqdas when we go on pilgrimage. The circumlocution is a sort of pivotal, gravitational process. He doesn't go directly and say what he means. He goes around it. He circles it. He does it through rhetorical questions. It's a kind of orbit. And in the process of orbiting a concept, you seem to get closer and closer to it. But he never actually utters it. In just a small example is the way in which he uses that concept. He who hath. And then we never actually get a name for him, but we get the definition of what he hath done. And that is what I call circumlocution. I think I've spelt it wrong. Space and time. Shoghi Effendi has this panoramic vision, as you know. And I always saw this as a kind of camera. He has this ability to zoom in into tiny details and then zoom out and give you this vision, both geographic and temporal, of the scale, excuse me, of what he's describing. Sometimes it literally is geographic. He's talking about the planet. Other time when he's talking about history, you get the feeling he's zooming back into the past and zooming forward into the future, so that you get a sense more clearly of the present. And he manages to do that sometimes in one sentence. There are certain very, very famous sentences where he does that. You get the feeling you've traversed time and space in the course of one breath. And then the last thing is just a mention of his music, because although Shoghi Effendi does use these very clear, precise tools of style, and we'll be looking at how he screws in the words into particular places into that structure of the sentence, the overall result is not something mechanical. Far from it. He creates this very characteristic music. And I've always associated Shoghi Effendi's music with the oboe, because it's got this plangent, plaintive, melancholy tone. And in the last courses that we did with Akuto, we always came back to those marvelous sentences. Never waver, never hesitate, never. Do you remember those ones? So that kind of aching music that is coming from his heart when he adjures us. I adjure them. by the blood. Do you remember those? That's what I call the music. And that was the last of the techniques of style to look at when we were doing it. But of course, as you can see, this is enormous. This is huge. And even if we only look at one sentence for each one of those stylistic methods, it would take us, days and days to really explore it in length. If we can go to the next page, which is examples of opposition, Jeremiah, I will now show you how, when it comes to that the first dialectic method, no, it's the one before that. I'm so sorry. It's the one that says examples of opposition before we get to, yeah, it's just before that. Nope. Yeah, there you go. It's page 2 of, there you go. These are just a collection of only 4 sentences that I could explore with you for the dialectic method. Now, of course, we don't have time to do that. There's just no way. I've already spent almost half an hour introducing this. So we're going to only take 2 of those sentences. I've just given that as an example of how many places he uses this same dialectic cantilever principle of opposition. But I thought it would be helpful for you to see those 4, because you will find many, many more in your readings. And if we have time, I'd like to do number 1, such simultaneous processes, and number 2, the heroes. So now we're going to go to such simultaneous processes, and we'll see how I've structured that. If you don't mind, Jeremiah, we'll go to that next quote that you have several times brought up on the screen. Am I tiring you all out? Are you all exhausted? I'm sorry.
Not at all. Not at all. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Now, I'm going to read this sentence just through to start with. It's from The Advent of Divine Justice. It's on page 72. And I think I've said enough already about context and given you the history. Do you realize there was one other context I did not give you, which is in detail the context of the work itself from which that particular sentence has been taken. That obviously is of vital importance, but we don't have time to do everything, and I didn't want to spend more time than necessary introducing this idea of how to read. So I will just plunge in and read this sentence and then tell you what I've done with it. Here it goes. Such simultaneous processes of rise and of fall, of integration and of disintegration, of order and chaos, with their continuous and reciprocal reactions on each other, are but aspects of a greater plan, one and indivisible, whose source is God, whose author is Baha'u'llah, the theatre of whose operations is the entire planet, and whose ultimate objectives are the unity of the human race and the peace of all mankind. Now, when you read that on the page, you say, okay, that's a mouthful. Now, what I've done, and this is my method for my own clarity of mind, if you can go, show us the full sentence there, Jeremiah, it helps. If you can, keep going down a little bit. No, or we can't go any further. We can't go any further. What I've done here is, thank you. That would be great. Excellent. Very good. If you can see this, when you see it visually, you will immediately understand what I mean by the cantilever principle. It's like a seesaw, okay? You've got a pivot in the middle. And when you first start reading, you don't see that pivot, that central axe. You start such simultaneous processes and you don't quite know what's going to come next. But when you break it up, you realize that he's actually giving you the simultaneous processes visually and conceptually. He's putting them in opposition to one another. Rise on the one side, fall on the other. Integration as against disintegration. Order as against chaos. And therefore, just to introduce you to my little codes, I have put what I call the main sentence in capitals. Okay? So the capital letters there are telling you what he's actually saying. In brief, he's saying such processes, I should have made the word simultaneous even smaller because it's only an adjective. Such processes are but aspects of a greater plan. That's what he's saying. Everything else is qualifying, modifying, adding, and describing what he means. They're like the clothing on the central bone structure. The main sentence is subject, verb, and sometimes object. Okay? So you've got processes is your real main verb, main noun at the top there, are a greater plan. They're aspects of a greater plan. If you really want to bring it down to the bone-thin main clause, main sentence, it's processes are plan. Processes are a greater plan. The greater is the qualifying adjective there. Now, once you've got that in your head, once you realize that what he's really saying is such simultaneous processes are but aspects of a greater plan, then you begin to understand what the rest of it is doing. So everything under such simultaneous processes that I've divided into that cantilever process of, rise and fall, integration, disintegration, is telling you more about processes, isn't it? All of that is baggage around the word processes. It's defining and qualifying and describing what he means by processes. So in fact, the rising is not different from the falling. They're both processes. The integration is as much part of the process as disintegration, and order is the same as chaos. This is a really revolutionary way of looking at oppositions, because we come from a world of binary thinking where all of our oppositions are cancelling each other out all the time. We see them always as being contradictory. We do not see them as being connected. And Shoghi Effendi is literally showing us in this sentence. He's saying it and he's showing it. And his grammar is illustrating that these processes, which appear to be contradictory, are all actually part of, are aspects of a greater plan. Now, that section that I have put in italics, if you notice, such simultaneous processes of rise and of fall, of integration and of disintegration, of order and chaos, with their continuous and reciprocal reactions on each other. That's a tremendously important clause. It's not the main sentence, it's a subsidiary clause in the grammar. And it's telling you more about the way in which the processes work. It's an adjectival clause qualifying the word processes, okay? It's going back to processes again. All the rest of those little words of opposition are also telling you more about processes. But that one clause, which if you notice, has to be read continuously in reaction to each other. You can't break it up. If we go up to the top again, Jeremiah, if you can go up to where I put the sentence up there. If you were just reading it and saying, such simultaneous processes of rise and of fall, of integration and of disintegration, of order and chaos with their continuous and reciprocal reactions on each other, you've missed the point. What you have to do, because it's demanding that you do it, is when you get to with their continuous and reciprocal reactions on each other, don't you dare breathe. You can't breathe there. You have to have that continuous. So you better be sure that after you get to the word chaos, you take a very deep breath. Such simultaneous processes of rise and of fall, he allows you to breathe, of integration and of disintegration, he allows you to breathe, of order and chaos. Breathe, because you have to have a very deep breath there, with their continuous and reciprocal reactions on each other. Because if you don't say that all in one great big breath, you've missed the continuity and you've missed the reciprocity. You need to have that all together. By the way, one of the things I didn't tell you right at the beginning about reading Shoghi Effendi is you have to read it with your body. This is not just coming from up here. It's not even just the mouth or even the throat. You've got to do it with your lungs. You've got to do it with your heart. You've got to, by the time you've finished some of his sentences, your heart is beating, believe me. And the ideal way of reading is actually to stand up and move your whole body around. Some people do aerobics. I just do Shoghi Effendi sentences. Seriously. Anyway, their continuous and reciprocal reactions on each other are but aspects only of a greater plan. Now, if we can come down again, dear Jeremiah, so that we can see the rest of that sentence fully, such simultaneous processes are but aspects of a greater plan. Now look at what Shoghi Effendi does. One and indivisible. Now everything that's going to come next is telling you about a greater plan. Everything else is little phrases that are adjectival and sometimes a clause, the theatre of whose operations is the entire planet. There's a verb in there, so it's a clause. All of them are going back to the greater plan. And they have to be seen as telling you more and more about it. It's like stacking up bricks, you know? That's the only way that cantilever principle will work. They are aspects of that greater plan, one and indivisible, whose source is God, whose author is Baha'u'llah, the theatre of whose operations is the entire planet, and whose ultimate objectives are the unity of the human race and the peace of all mankind. There you've got the whole post there, on which you can begin to see the unity between rise and fall, the continuity and the reciprocity between integration and disintegration, the mingling and merging of order and chaos. I wanted to start with that sentence, and I have to stop now because time is passing, because it's so relevant to our particular virus, the epidemic that we're experiencing today of oppositional thinking. The disease that we've been afflicted with all over the world of thinking in terms of either or. It's one or the other. There can't be any alternative. And Shoghi Effendi is showing us that the greater plan, one and indivisible, whose source is God, whose author is Baha'u'llah, etc., is telling us the opposite. It's telling us that these apparent contradictions, these seeming conflicts, these visible and very painful oppositional ways of thinking, these binary energies that are pulling our society apart, racially, politically, in every possible way, we're being pulled into opposite camps. That these actually, if you look at the greater plan, if you understand that they are simultaneous processes, that they are linked, that their core source is one and indivisible, God, Baha'u'llah, whose operation is the entire planet, then you can begin to see them coordinating and coming together. I hope that that's sufficient to just show you visibly in a very simple sentence of Shoghi Effendi's how he plays with this remarkable concept of dialectic thinking and how he brings a kind of revolutionary light to us, especially relevant to our times, to see that there is that cohesion in it, that unity at the core of it. Of course, there's so much more to say. And one of the things I said in my earlier page, which had the physics of Shoghi Effendi, I don't know if you can bear to go back to that briefly, dear Jeremiah, just so that I can remind people why it was the one before, or the page before, I can't remember now. No, it was the page that starts the simultaneous. No, it's, yeah, the page one of that. Page one of that. Great, up at the top. Very good. So I tried to tell you here why I was concentrating on these different methods of reading, because they were reflective of the subject matter that we were studying in the Akuto courses on the world order. Because my father was speaking about the twin processes of integration and disintegration. He was talking about the twin institutions of the guardianship and the Universal House of Justice. He was exploring Shoghi Effendi's way of interpreting history, his way of interpreting geography with his plans and his goals. He was speaking particularly about the way in which he was establishing the administrative order and particularly highlighting the role of America. And that's why I wanted to identify these specific methods of reading that would illustrate some of the themes that were being discussed in my dad's course. So that's just my little explanation for why that dialectic method became one of the significant ways in which we were analyzing sentences. Now I'm going to spend the last part of this little hour with you looking at the final sentence, which I've put here. The heroes, which is on the very last page, Jeremiah. Now this is a massive sentence if we look at the top. It comes from the beginning, pages 4 and 5 of God Passes By. And it's quite an extraordinary sentence. I mean, you can just see when you look at it sitting there on the page, it's just so long. And you say, how on earth can I ever understand it? It's really extraordinary. Now, remember, it comes from a book which is describing the history of the Baha'i faith, okay? So it's not the Dawnbreakers. It's telling us beyond the story of the Dawnbreakers. It's telling you the story of the Bab, the story of Baha'u'llah. Shoghi Effendi then continues with Abdul Baha and finally comes to the Baha'i administration in the last part of God Passes By. But here, in this particular sentence, he's describing the Dawnbreakers, okay? So that's where that sentence comes from, a description of the Dawnbreakers. And I was very much struck by this as an example of that dialectic method that he's using for his sentence structure. So if you don't mind, I'll first read it, and then we'll go and analyze it. The heroes whose deeds shine upon the record of this fierce spiritual contest, involving at once people, it's contest. I'll read it again. The heroes whose deeds shine upon the record of this fierce spiritual contest, involving at once people, clergy, monarch, and government, were the Bab's chosen disciples, the letters of the living, and their companions, the trail breakers of the new day, who to so much intrigue, ignorance, depravity, cruelty, superstition, and cowardice opposed a spirit exalted, unquenchable, and awe-inspiring, a knowledge surprisingly profound, an eloquence sweeping in its force, a piety unexcelled in fervor, a courage leonine in its fierceness, a self-abnegation saintly in its purity, a resolve granite-like in its firmness, a vision stupendous in its range, a veneration for the Prophet and his imams disconcerting to their adversaries, a power of persuasion alarming to their antagonists, a standard of faith and a code of conduct that challenged and revolutionized the lives of their countrymen. If you give that sentence to someone who's never read a sentence of Shoghi Effendi's, it will be just like trying to get through a thorn hedge backwards. It's very difficult to read, very. But when you break it down in the way that I've suggested, So we first look for the main sentence. What is it? What is Shoghi Effendi actually saying? What's the bottom line? He's saying something very simple, and you need the whole sentence there, Jeremiah. Thank you. A little bit more to the very bottom. We haven't got the last. Right, there we are. The heroes is what he's saying. The heroes were the Barb's chosen disciples and their companions. That's all he's saying. All of the rest of those words, that huge heap of words, is simply clarifying, qualifying, interpreting. Remember, he was our interpreter. Exemplifying the simple statement, the heroes were the Barb's chosen disciples and their companions. That's who the heroes were. But in order to say that simple thing, what he does is give us the dialectic method. Now I'm going to show you how that happens. So he starts off saying the heroes, and then he immediately clarifies it. He defines it with a little adjectival phrase, clause with the verb shine, whose deeds shine upon the record of this fierce spiritual contest. I've made a distinction between the bold in italics and the non-bold italics, because of this fierce spiritual context is telling you more about the record, okay? The actual statement there about the heroes is the heroes whose deeds shine upon the record. But then he tells you more about the record. It's a record of this fierce spiritual contest. You know, one of the things Shoghi Effendi does is he puts traps out for the reader, and I already stumbled on one of them. That word contest is very, very important. A contest is when you test your strength, you test your ability to rise above your previous limitations. It's not in opposition against anybody else necessarily. And in this sentence, we may not realize that when we first read that word contest. We think of the contest in oppositional terms. A tennis game, that lot on that side of the court against this lot on this side of the court. Or a football game contest, right? A contest of strength where you hold against somebody else's arm and you try to push it down. We think of that word immediately in oppositional terms. So we've got that sort of buried in the back of our head when we read that word. The heroes whose deeds shine upon the record of this fierce spiritual contest, and we are already arming those heroes and we're seeing them in opposition against their enemies, right? It's kind of our assumption. And then he goes on, this fierce spiritual contest involving at once people, clergy, monarch, and government. Now, when you read that very fast, the heroes whose deeds shine upon the record of this fierce spiritual contest involving at once people, clergy, monarch, and government, tell me which among you don't immediately assume that it's heroes against people, clergy, monarch, and government. That's our facile, superficial first reading of the meaning of that statement, that that's not what it's actually saying. But he's tripping you. He's put an invisible wire there, and your foot will trip on it if you don't read very, very carefully to see what's going to happen next. So he's telling us more about the contest. He's giving us that rather vague word involving, which we just quickly read because we didn't really understand what that meant at that stage of our reading. People, clergy, monarch, and government, we know all about the history of the Baha'i faith. We know there was persecution involving people, clergy, monarch, and government. But we always see them in opposition to the heroes. And we haven't asked ourselves what that word involving means right then. Remember, reading is an accumulative process. You read one word, then you read the other word, then you read the third word, and then you finally realize you didn't understand the first word. Maybe you should go back and begin again, and the next one, and the next one. And then by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you say, oh, I see, it wasn't what I thought. Let me go back again. Reading is all about rereading, always. Rereading and rereading. We were given one guardian, but we have a guardianship in the covenant. And we have to read and reread and reread the guardian over and over again in order to really be able to not mutilate this cause. That's part of what he says. The heroes whose deeds shine upon the record of this fierce spiritual contest involving at once people, clergy, monarch, and government. Do you notice how he goes from the democracy of the people to the ecclesiastics, to the royalty, to the politics? I mean, he's covering all bases there, right? He's got those 4 words covering all bases. Were the Bab's chosen disciples, and now he gives us who they were. He gives us that phrase, the letters of the living. Those are the chosen disciples. Those 18 precious souls, the letters of the living, from the earliest Mullah Hussein all the way to the last Quddus, and their companions. I find this the most touching part of this sentence. We always talk blithely about the 20,000 martyrs of the faith. They were the companions of those chosen disciples, and they were nameless, many of them. Often ignorant, many sometimes fanatical, maybe even deluded. They were what he calls the trailbreakers of the new day. Shoghi Effendi's marvelous with words. He's taken his own invention, dawn breakers. He's unscrewed it, and he's taken the other usual phrase we have, trailblazers, and he's unscrewed it. And he's put the 2 ends of those words together, beginning of one and the end of the other, so that we get trail breakers, not dawn breakers, nor trailblazers, but he's created a new word there, and it has meaning, because they're not just blazing a trail, they're breaking a trail of the new day. They are companions of those dawn breakers. Now, are you ready for this? Because at this point in the sentence, where we think we've understood, okay, the heroes are having this fantastic spiritual contest. They were the chosen disciples. They had these wonderful companions, the trail breakers of the new day. And they are in this spiritual contest involving, we've got all of the people and the monarchs and the clergy and the every lot. We've got the two opposing sides in our minds. Okay, and then he gives you, just when you think, well, that would be nice, Shoghi Effendi, just put a full stop there. It would be really helpful. Why do you put a comma? And why do you give us this extremely complex grammatical construction? Who to so much opposed, who to so much this opposed that. Now, this is where we get the key to understanding this sentence. All of these heroes who to so much, and look at the words, intrigue, ignorance, depravity, cruelty, superstition, and cowardice, opposed. Now, we won't go any further than that for the minute. But when you see that, you are just overwhelmed. I mentioned the list that Shoghi Effendi uses. This is an example of enumeration. He's not just saying, to make it sound lilting and musical, intrigue and ignorance, depravity and cruelty, superstition and cowardice. It sounds like a little dance. No, he's like hurling stones at us. Intrigue, ignorance, depravity, and the weight of those words, if you consider each one of them separately, is so heavy. Intrigue, ignorance, depravity, cruelty, superstition, and cowardice. Who to so much of that, and you think, well, how can you oppose cruelty? How can you oppose intrigue? What is there going to be for you to be able to oppose depravity and superstition? Where do we find anything that can confront those tremendously heavy, abstract nouns, which is what they are. Abstract, but by God, when we read them there in that sentence, they feel concrete. They feel like concrete. They sort of bury you under the concrete. They're so heavy. Ignorance, depravity, etc. Who to so much of that, now look what he does. Opposed, now this is a whole new way of defining opposition. You oppose intrigue with a spirit, a knowledge, an eloquence, a piety, a courage, a self-abnegation, a resolve, a vision, a veneration for the Prophet and his followers and his imams, a power of persuasion, a standard of faith, etc., etc. I have done that because I want you to see when you first read this, those phrases that come after the word opposed have two parts to them. Oppose a spirit, but then after that comes a description of what kind of spirit that is. It is a spirit that is exalted, unquenchable, and awe-inspiring. That little adjectival phrase I've put in italics so that you can distinguish it from what is being opposed, okay? You're actually opposing intrigue and ignorance. You're opposing ignorance with knowledge and eloquence. You're opposing depravity with piety and courage, or rather cruelty with courage. Do you see what I'm saying? You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 massive abstract nouns. And in opposition to those, he has given you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. He's opposed 12 against the 6. And he's not only given you 12 abstract nouns against those 6 appalling abstract depravities, he's given you additional phrases that define them. So they become lucid, they become rich, they become embroidered with meaning. So you get the opposition to intrigue with the spirit, and the ignorance with the knowledge and eloquence, and the depravity with the courage and so forth. But you also get this spirit is unquenchable. It is exalted and awe-inspiring. The knowledge is surprisingly profound. The eloquence is sweeping in its force. The piety unexcelled in fervor. The courage leonine in its fierceness, and so on and so forth. All the way down to a veneration for the Prophet and his imams, disconcerting to their adversaries. Now, when you get to that word adversaries, it should remind you of being tripped up with the word contest. You go back to the beginning and you say, wait a minute, this fierce spiritual contest was not necessarily against people, clergy, monarch, and government. It involved people, clergy, monarch, and government. It is opposed to ignorance and intrigue, depravity and cruelty. Those are the enemies. Now, in the people, clergy, monarch, and government, they were some of the chosen disciples and their companions. We know that Yahya was one of the great Vahid, the great Vahid, was himself one of the high clergymen of that period. Mullah Hussein was a scholar of that period, as was Tahir, of course. Many of them were among, and we have even members of the government who became Babis in that period. So we realize that that facile assumption about who is against who is something we have to reconsider when we get to their adversaries. So the adversaries of the heroes were those who demonstrated intrigue, ignorance, depravity, cruelty, superstition, and cowardice from among the people, clergy, monarch, and government. Do you see? So it sort of makes you rethink who your enemies are, basically. There are those abstract nouns, because your friends are also among the people, clergy, monarch, and government. You got your heroes who are on both sides of that divide. There is no divide. In fact, it's a division, it's an opposition who to so much this oppose that, which is completely spiritual. It makes you go back again, you realize it's a fierce spiritual contest that is going on. So your opposition is, vision against superstition, courage against cowardice, a veneration of the Prophet and his Imams, disconcerting to their adversaries because they assumed they were heretics, and they showed veneration instead. They showed knowledge as well as eloquence about the Quran and the Prophet. And then we get to the last ones, a power of persuasion, alarming to their antagonists. Now we've got adversaries, we've got antagonists, and we know that both of those could be found among people, clergy, monarch, and government, that they are the ones that demonstrate the intrigue, the ignorance, the depravity. Those are the real adversaries. The real antagonism comes from that spiritual depravity, that spiritual cowardice. And then he comes to the end, a standard of faith and a code of conduct that challenged and revolutionized the lives of their countrymen. I hope that I've come to the end there because it's a really big one and I've tired you out. But do you see in the structure alone on the page how Shoghi Effendi creates a way of looking at oppositions in a new and fresh way, a way of understanding the definition of heroism in a new and revolutionary way. Our heroism is in our spirit, our knowledge, our eloquence, our piety. It is not this person against that, this party against that. I really believe that Shoghi Effendi is prophetic in the way he structures some of these sentences. It's almost as if he saw way ahead of his time to some of the spiritual contests that we are facing today. And that was one of the other reasons why I hoped that it would be possible to read this magnificent sentence with you. That's all I have to say. And I think if you want to talk, you can talk now. Isn't that the way it goes?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Well, we do have someone who has their hand raised, and I think that plenty of people have questions. So a good place to start, we have a hand raised, Miss Vaya.
Oh, Bahiyyih John, Allah Hapa. You talk about the beloved guardian sign of God on the earth. You make me my heart 1,000 times jump, and I jump from my chair 100 times because it was my favorite subject of my husband, George. This writing of beloved guardian, deep ocean, is all the jewels, tamam jawahir under. I want as the Baha'i, we Baha'i suggest to our beloved Supreme Universal House of Justice, after Abdul Baha's ascension, we should have 100 Baha'i conference, deepening about the writing of the beloved guardian, essential of beloved guardian. I remember one time my husband was reading beloved guardian writing in the feast, one person jumped. Why you reading beloved guardian in the feast? You know you should not read. My husband came home cry and cry with a tear, wrote beautiful letter to beloved Universal House of Justice as question. And the beloved House of Justice wrote beautiful answer. Thank Baha'u'llah, we have Supreme Universal House of Justice. They said, yes, you can read it. After Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha's beloved guardian writing, beautiful letter. If anybody wants this letter, George, the Cathy Hawkinson asked George about this letter. He said he wants to send to the Baha'i Administration Committee National Center. They didn't know about that. So beautiful letter. I just want to really thank, and the Baha'i should read priceless prayer about the beloved guardian. I wrote 100 times, like suffering of beloved guardian, the writing, you explain so beautiful. And you should have lots of disciplining like that. The last one, I know a lot of Baha'i have questioned, because I know your father raised with the beloved guardian in the Holy Land. What is your favorite story, if you can mention? And the last thing, I met you first time, International Baha'i Convention in the house of Abdul Baha Ruhi Khanum, invite our National Assembly for dinner. and you come sit on the ground, on the carpet, and Ruhi Khanum said, get up, why are you sitting like mush, like mouse, go sit on the chair, if you remember that story. I love you, sorry. Thank you, Bahiyyih John.
All right. Well, okay. Do you have a story actually to share?
No. I don't think this is the appropriate moment for such subjects. If anybody would like to say anything they thought, it doesn't have to be questions, but when you're reading these wonderful sentences, did anyone have any other thoughts about the words, about what Shoghi Effendi is actually saying? That would be wonderful to share.
I think, Alex, you have your hand raised. Would you like to share?
Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Nakhjavani. This was overwhelming, actually, but it puts things in perspective in the sense that the Guardian he's an educated individual. His Holiness Abdul Baha did not go to school, and he is showing us the way to approach history, or a way which we are all invited to follow. And we are all scholars like he is, and you are a scholar yourself. Your approach is inquisitive, and yes. So it just occurred to me how it seems like he's closed the book of history in a sense. The House of Justice is following. We love our supreme institution. The House of Justice is following the pattern of scholarship and analysis of the Guardian, and it will at least 1,000 years, and perhaps, yes, even more. It's very foundational, of course. Thank you so much.
Ms. Nakhjavani, if you may, can you repeat your question for everyone?
My question? Oh, yes, I was just saying, if, I shared 2 particular sentences with you, and I also shared some ideas of the methods of understanding Shoghi Effendi's style. And I just wondered whether anybody had any personal response to some of those sentences, the words used by Shoghi Effendi, or whether you have had insights about whether you have also had ways of reading Shoghi Effendi that you'd like to share. I would like to repeat that I don't want anybody to feel that I've got some kind of definitive method. I really hope you don't feel that way. This is just a kind of tool to break down the sentence so we can see it more clearly and approach it more easily. But I think everybody has ways of reading. So it's really just a tool for reading. And maybe in the course of those 2 sentences that I shared with you, you may have had insights or thoughts that you would like to share. It's really just a suggestion, not a question.
Sure. There is a question from someone actually regarding reading the writings of Shoghi Effendi, and this is just a request for a suggestion. What books do you suggest to understand the circumstances of the writing of God Passes By? Is there any study guide for this book for one who's interested to start God Passes By?
Well, I think you have to understand what was happening in... Well, I don't know how to answer that question. I don't think we have a study guide yet for God Passes By, but I think Shoghi Effendi actually gives us the history itself of... he's giving us the study guide. He's giving us how to understand the history of the faith. It's an amazing book. He really is giving us a potted history of the faith in this book. And if you really want to understand it in depth, of course, you can read everything about the history of the faith and all the wonderful commentaries written by great historians like Mr. Bahiyyih and so forth. But I mean, Shoghi Effendi was giving it in a compact form in God Passes By itself, so that in one volume we get 100 years, you know. That's really what it is. And Ruhia Khanum has written something absolutely beautiful about it. I don't think I've got that included in any of my handouts to you, but she wrote a description of it, which is absolutely marvelous, about it being, you know, a seedbed, a mother book, if you like, which contains the potential for many, many other books. In other words, there are many books that could be written from out of one or two sentences of God Passes By. You know, it's like a potential for many other books. Yeah.
It's a seed.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. You know, one of the things maybe I could explain, that we did this in Greenacre, and also, of course, in all the years in Akuto, after a 1 hour session where I share a method, the natural thing to do is to break up into workshops. And that, unfortunately, I don't think we can do today. But it's not really an question answer thing. It's a sharing as if we were a workshop, you know, as if we were analyzing a sentence together. And then in those little workshops, there would be a whole pile of them. There would be only about 6 or 8 or maybe 9 people. And it would be possible to have a real exchange. And everybody in the group would really struggle with a sentence. So it was hands-on. After you'd had a blurb from me, you know, then everybody sort of started really working on it. So, yeah.
I actually have a passage that I've pulled up, which will be excellent to go over, because it is not just a passage from Shoghi Effendi, but one that I've been very much enamored by. I'm going to share it now. Here we are. Please tell me if you can see my screen.
Yes.
So this is the paragraph. Well, a sentence as well. And,
yes, it's an entire sentence. Yeah.
And this, what I've personally analyzed it to be, is a 3-pronged statement, which are the ingredients for this effect. That's the cause for this effect, which Shoghi Effendi says, if we do those 3 things, those 3 prongs, we will reach this conclusion. And just from one thing that I found to be very brilliant is he uses semicolons to separate each separate prong. And then lastly, he uses, this is an M dash I learned recently. Says how much I'm learning as I go. But maybe we could
Can you identify where the main sentence is there?
The main sentence to me is the entirety of the sentence. Which,
no.
Okay, and please.
Nope. The main sentence is very simple. His main sentence is, these are the ideals which the American believers must strive to promote. That's it. That's the main sentence. Everything that comes before that is telling you what the ideals are. Everything that comes after that is telling you more about, you know, how they promote in both their private and public lives, ideals with Java. Okay, that's it. These are the ideals. That's what the main sentence is. You know, when you focus on what is the core of what he's saying, then you understand what all the rest is. It's telling you that you have to have the rectitude, the abiding sense of undeviating justice. These are the ideals that we must strive to promote. And then how do we do it? It's very, very useful to hone in, first find that main sentence, and then you begin to see the wood for the trees. Otherwise, you say what you did. You say a rectitude of conduct. The whole thing is the sentence. Well, I mean, he structures that because he wants you to read the whole thing for sure. But he's doing it in that way so that you only get to the actual core main sentence after you've plowed through all these others. Now, what is all this? What's all this rectitude? What's all this pure? What is it? These are the ideals which we must strive. Okay? That's the core. Yeah.
What I find interesting is that this one sentence seems to be the frame for the rest of what he discusses in this Advent and Divine Justice.
Yes,
He
yes.
goes one by one, describes rectitude of conduct, but then
Brilliant.
he sources
Yes.
from the Baha'i writings directly from the pen of Baha'u'llah.
Yeah. Now you're doing the next step from my course. You have to take over, because I just did the one sentence, and then what you're doing is using that sentence to analyze the whole book. Fantastic. That's exactly what we have to do.
Oh, thank you for confirming that. I'm just, I thought that something I'm actually working with that I'm personally connected to, maybe you would be able to help. So apparently, what was, so how many steps are there? 1, 2, 4?
We've got rectitude, undeviating justice, unobscured by doubt. That is telling you more about the kind of justice. A chaste and pure, that's number 3. Chaste and pure life, unsullied, is telling you more about it, which are inherently deficient and positive. A fraternity, that's 4. Fraternity is number 4. And then he's telling you what it is, freed from that cancerous growth of racial prejudice, which is eating into the vitals of an already debilitating. These. So he's got 4 things there. Rectitude, justice, a chaste and pure and holy life, and a fraternity. Everything else is telling you more about the rectitude, more about the sense of justice, more about the holy life, and more about the fraternity. You know, when you begin to focus in on that, and you see how it's almost like the human body, you know, first find out the spine, get the spine, then realize, you know, you've got your arms hanging from here and there. You've got your legs dangling from there and there. This is how it's connected. Then you begin to understand what he means. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for helping to describe this.
By contradicting you so rudely, which is what I did.
Oh, not at all. The intent was to bring this so we can learn together. So thank you.
Yes, yes.
So I just muted myself. So there is a question from someone, and I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm trying to figure out how. There we go. All right. So the question is, with the velocity of verbal language changing so rapidly between new generations to less than a decade, and the art of reading disappearing in youth, how do we entice and encourage the youth to read the Guardian's poetic literature? Mm-hmm. And this is a question from someone in our community, and it's a question I have as well. What do you recommend from your personal experience? Maybe a way we can do more further research ourselves.
Well, I really believe that we've lost the art of reading, and it's one of the most devastating things, because if we can't read, we don't know how language works. And when we don't link words together and understand how language works, we can't think. If we can't think, then why do we call ourselves a democracy or anything else? Leave alone the 7 valleys and our spiritual destiny. It's all about thinking. It's about the rational process. So we definitely have to learn how to read again. And I start from rock bottom. I start word by word, and the experience of a single sentence is enough for me as a ladder. I also feel that one of the reasons why we've stopped reading, and I think your questioner is so right about the speed and the velocity and is we get bored. We think it's boring. We think that stopping and thinking and weighing and measuring and sucking the juice out of every single word, we don't realize how exciting it is. We've lost track of the drama of it. We don't realize that it's a challenge to us. There's Shoghi Effendi tricking us, for goodness sakes, testing us. Did you make that facile assumption? Yes, you did. Well, I'm going to wake you up. Who to so much this, oppose that? I mean, that's really tough grammar, you know. He's constantly playing games with us. He's our true brother, and he wants to make us true readers, to play with him, to understand the magnitude of what he's saying. But I don't think we will get young people or anybody, old or young, to want to read unless we make it exciting, unless we make it dramatic, unless we bring it to life. I mean, there are things that you find in a single sentence of Shoghi Effendi, sometimes that make you weep. Honestly, I don't want to get into that today, but you can really, really find yourself so moved just by feeling that power of that sentence. But, you know, I don't know, let's just have fun with it and start from scratch. Start with a single sentence. Throw it like a ball and say, what can you do with this, you know? And then after one sentence comes another, and then we start doing what you so cleverly did. You see that the whole of the advent of divine justice is kind of compacted and contained inside the shell of that one sentence. That's brilliant. Then you begin to play that game, right? It's fabulous. So it's a wonderful, wonderful art. But as you say, we've lost it because of the speed. And because we've also put so much emphasis on the visual that we've lost the oral. And that's why we need to rethink that oral. If you remember that sentence I read to you right at the beginning by Joan Didion, if you don't mind, I'll just quickly read it again because she says something there which I think is an answer to your questioner as well. It's the comparison she makes between the camera and the sentence, if you remember. I'll just read it again. To shift the structure of a sentence alters the meaning of that sentence as definitively and inflexibly as the position of a camera alters the meaning of the object photographed. It's all about framing, right? You look at it from a different angle, you see a different picture. You widen or you close your zoom, you see a different story. The same thing is happening with sentences. And then she goes on. Many people know about camera angles now, but not many know about sentences. The arrangement of the words matters. I think that really is the bottom line. Maybe we can come to this question by even asking ourselves and our youth and everyone around us, you know, how do we distinguish between the true and the false? It's all about camera angles. It's all about in-depth reading. And we're being manipulated all the time by the media. So the sharper our minds become, the clearer you know, we hear the meanings of the words, the less we'll be manipulated. Maybe young people could be teased and seduced into wanting to read more just to know that they're not going to be manipulated and made fools of, you know? That's one way of stroking the ego so that you do the thing that's good for you.
Yes, definitely. There actually, there is the point of asking questions, I think, as well. If you have the subject, that's the subject matter, and the person brings it to you and you just take it as truth, the question is, what are the assumptions that you're using to say what you're saying?
That's right. Yeah.
It's not that it's bad to question assumptions. It's important to know where is it coming from before you accept it.
Camera angle, yeah.
So there is a question, and this is from Alex. I asked him to provide the quote before we ask you the question. So I'm going to first read his question, then I'm going to read you the quote. How do you understand the beloved guardian's statement that whoever reads his writings with attention and care, he uses the word plumbing. I think he meant another word, but plumbing the depths of their meaning will be free of affliction, both spiritual and material. Now I'll read that quote so it's better. Indeed, if an avowed follower of Baha'u'llah were to immerse himself in and fathom, that's what I think he meant by plumbing, and fathom the depths of the ocean of these heavenly teachings, and with utmost care and attention deduce from each of them the subtle mysteries and consummate wisdom that lie enshrined therein, such a person's life, materially, intellectually, and spiritually, will be safe from toil and trouble, unaffected by these setbacks and perils, or any sadness or despondency. I think it's self-explanatory, Alex, but would you like to maybe ask your question? I think you'll be better asking your question if you unmute.
Thank you. Yes, it's just the dynamics of this study. It seems to have an influence on our soul, despondency, perils, sadness, unaffected by setbacks. It's quite astounding, and of course, we have many motivations to read the writings: attraction to beauty and thirst for understanding, and we find this plenty in the beloved Guardian's writings. But then there's this as well. I mean, this. If only we knew this. What if you had any comment? I'd be much.
If only we knew it. I mean, I think you've just summed up the dilemma of progressive revelation. If only we'd listen to it, we wouldn't need the next one and the next one. I mean, if only, of course, we do, because we keep growing. But we are constantly having to go back and be reminded. And I love your word plummet, because that has that weight of the lead in it that goes down to the very bottom of the ocean. It is fathom and it is plummet, and he's asking us to dive, like Baha'u'llah says, immerse yourselves. We really have to get drowned. One of the things I love about Shoghi Effendi's sentences is that they drown you. I mean, you literally are gasping for air because you haven't had time to take a breath. You know, they're so long. And if you take a breath in the wrong way, without understanding the structure, you destroy the meaning because you breathed in the wrong way. It's a dance, you know, you have to know when. It's like singing. So I think these words, this challenge Shoghi Effendi is giving us to plummet, to fathom, to dive deep into those so that we can acquire those spiritual qualities. It's really the reason why I find it necessary to read the sentences the way I do, because, you know, just going back to the last one I read about the heroes, I mean, the heroes are those that have a spirit, a knowledge, an eloquence, a piety, a courage, leonine in its fierceness. I mean, wouldn't you like to have those qualities? I mean, in a way, what he's doing is he's inviting us to read him so deeply that we acquire a spirit, a knowledge, an eloquence, a piety, a courage, a self-abnegation, because it's embedded even in his words. Are you really in Norway? Are you actually in Norway?
Oh, of course, yes.
Wow, this is amazing. To be speaking to somebody in Norway. What a privilege. Lovely. Excellent. Sorry, I've talked too much.
Thank you so much.
And for those of you who have heard the quote was posted by Alex for everyone in the chat. So if you open your chat, you'll be able to see the quote that was read. So you can, I suppose, copy and paste it for your own reference. There are questions from several people. I'm trying to get to all of you. I apologize for the slowness of my reach out. Sorry about that, everyone. There is several people asking a similar question, so I will be merging them into one. There are questions among those in the chat asking, is there going to be a course? Will there be a similar to, excuse my poor memory.
In Akuto?
Yes.
The Akuto course.
Something similar to that course offered by chance?
I don't know. Not by me. I mean, I know that I was inspired by that time and that place and that purpose, and I really feel privileged to share the little glimpses of it. But, you know, if it's going to be done as a course, that's not in my hands. I certainly haven't set out to do that. But it was certainly a wonderful period that we had. And I see that there was quite a number of people who were in Akuto, who are in this chat, which is marvelous. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. I don't know. That depends on who wants it, I suppose, and where it can be done, and if it can be done, and maybe other people can do it, you know. We don't have priests in the faith, thank God.
Of course, of course. Yeah, of course. So that is the answer for all of you. All of you have asked that question. I do want to call our attention to Terrence. If you would like to restate your comment in the chat, you're more than welcome to. Terrence,
Which comment are you referring to?
ooh, that's a good point.
I agree that we have lost the ability to think critically. Is that it, Terence?
Yes. I mean, when I try to teach people about the faith, I mean, it's like, you know, people are going with assumptions. And, you know, to me, you know, being able to think critically, you know, since as Baha'is, we're encouraged to use the scientific method of discerning of what's true and what's false. Therefore, I think what we need to do is, you know, use our observational faculty, you know, our eyes, and, you know, try to, you know, reason with people. I mean, I'm discouraged by watching the media, how people, I mean, they go by, you know, they say something and they get all emotional, and, you know, they focus. Well, I'm not saying that emotions are bad. It's just like you have to kind of control them. And, you know, it's just, you know, people just, you know, go after their own vain imaginings and idle fancies and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, and that's basically what I'm trying to get at, is that, you know, the ability to think critically is an art in itself, and it's something that everybody's born with. It's just, see, I was born and raised Catholic, and to me, critical thinking was never part of our religion. I mean, I asked questions and everybody just ignored me and, you know, tried to slough me off as, you know, some sort of insane person. But, you know, that's just a comment.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing with your experiences with us, and more importantly, we hope that as you have exposure to the writings of Shoghi Effendi, that as a part of the solution, as Shoghi Effendi himself describes, we all educate ourselves and we all try our best to master these writings. So when someone does have a question, someone who comes to you with an issue, you will be equipped to help them with that issue. There was a gentleman, Donald Streets. If you can hear me and can unmute yourself, please, or you are muted.
Yeah, I'd be it's so nice to hear.
Hello, dear Don. How are you?
I'm fine. Back to you. I think it was who was the author who said that the most fundamental mistake in communications is having made the assumption that it has taken place. With that in mind, and the comment of British scholar Alfred North Whitehead, he says we only understand that which we clothe in experience. We've used words in common: community, faith, scholarship, whatever, making the generous assumption that we have all clothed those words with the same experience. And I'm finding out, especially in my role as an educator, that people can use the same words and mean something very different. So my question is, if there's any merit to these observations, what suggestions, as someone who I respect as being brilliant in the understanding of the function of language, what advice do you have when working with especially young people who are struggling to, in the words of Whitehead, gain a clearer apprehension of God's purpose for man? Or that's the Guardian's definition of deepening, rather.
Gosh, Don, you've got far more experience. You've done it all your life, and who am I to say? But as you were speaking, it occurred to me that precisely because we all have our own assumptions and definitions, and as Baha'is, we have the privilege of the guardian as the divinely appointed interpreter, I wonder if we can't actually take a lesson from some of his methods in even writing to see whether those methods could be used to help. I was just thinking, one of the ways in which he started was by saying, you know, it is not. The Baha'i faith, the faith standing identified with the name of Baha'u'llah is not, you know, disclaims any intention to, you know, he uses the negative. Maybe one of the things we can do is to invite people that we're talking to, the kids we're talking to tell us what they're not doing, who they are not. Define yourself not by your identity, by what, but first deduct what you are not. And then you'll discover that actually what you're deducting is what nobody is. Deep down, you'll find points of similarity with others as you deduct. And the other is the idea of circumlocution. You know, I really wonder whether one of the ways in which we can communicate better is to circle around the thing and come at it more and more, you know, closer and closer and closer, but never actually, you know, spell it out or pin it out. I think a lot of people are very delicate and we don't have the words. Our words are clumpy, clumsy, awful things, and they thud around and destroy. So we have to really tread with enormous care and delicacy. And that means going around it, you know, and that's one of the things Shoghi Effendi teaches us to do in his reading. So maybe he gives us a few tools. I don't know. I think, you know, the great educationalists like Whitehead that you have referred to have done an enormous amount of work in analyzing how to approach a young mind. But perhaps also, you know, the vision that Shoghi Effendi gives us, that sense of panorama. I know that I used to, as a very simple primary school teacher in my long ago days in Cyprus, when I had a room full of very rowdy 10-year-olds, I used to come in and the only thing I could do to get them to be absolutely quiet was to turn my back to them, take a piece of chalk and begin to write on the board. And I would put I, N, F, I, N, I, and by the time I got to the T and the Y, you could have heard a pin drop in the room. I used to just write the word infinity and they would be as quiet as mice. It was amazing. I mean, sometimes you just have to give them a sense of how small we are and how big the universe is, you know, quite apart from how little we know and how great knowledge is and how humble we need to be in the face of that. Anyway, these are, I think, you know better than me, but I have a feeling Shoghi Effendi could give us a few clues in the techniques he uses, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very scintillating indeed. Speaking of comments, we have a Carl Rutstein who's been patiently waiting. And
I just wanted to say, Bahiyyih, that I took that course at Greenacre several years ago, and I've listened to this discussion very early on when you first taught us the way to read Shoghi Effendi, and I have found that it translates to prayers,
Yes.
to other readings. And I'm thinking of the prayer for the fast, where it says, I beseech thee. And then it has all these qualifiers. Who are you beseeching? And then finally it says, to cast me not away from the, et cetera, et cetera. And I have found that just learning a little bit about that technique of looking at the first sentence and then diving in to find what is it referring to?
Yes, yes.
And then the House of Justice recently wrote us a message saying, every promulgator of the faith of Baha'u'llah must profoundly meditate upon it. What is we asking to meditate? Upon the oneness of humanity. And then to learn its demanding implications for a profound alteration of thought and action required at this time. And so once you get a hold of this wonderful gift of this technique, not to say that I can do it, but I think for me, I have to read and reread and reread. I have to read these books over and over. And maybe those of us who love to read and reread the books of Baha'u'llah and Shoghi Effendi and Abdul Baha, we should promulgate this gospel and tell everybody how wonderful it is to be able to understand a little bit better. And it is exciting. It's thrilling. And I just want to thank you so much, because this is just so wonderful for my heart and for everyone. I hope everyone will go back immediately.
Oh, Carol, thank you so much.
So there is an excellent question that was posed that is from from a member in our community locally. And the question is, and I have to say, I'm very happy this person formulated that question, because it's a very hard thing to formulate as well, hard to articulate it. How do we teach the youth to separate their ideas from their idea of the entity that is formed through their environment that may not actually reflect reality? How do we entice them to search for the truth that may or may not agree with their position? Today, they migrate toward people that are of the same perception through the internet instead of independent investigation of the truth and their alignment to the Holy Spirit, that is the writings of Baha'u'llah. So that is an excellent question. I can elaborate a little more to say that in the modern age, you have people who will gravitate to those that agree with them rather than embrace this altruistic search after an objective truth that may or may not agree with what their lifestyle is, what they want to believe the world to be. So how do we teach, how do we inspire, how do we teach the youth to separate their ideas from their entity that's formed through their environment?
Well, I think one of the things we desperately need today is a new narrative, a new myth, a new story. We need to redefine what heroism is. And that's one of the other reasons why I took that sentence, because we have to become new kinds of heroes. You know, we've had 6,000 years of the hero bearing his breast and showing his muscle. It's always been a male hero as well. But we've got a new definition of heroism today. And what could be more exciting than to invite a young person to redefine himself as the hero of a spiritual contest, which is so fierce that it is going to engage him in combating who to so much this opposes that, to, in other words, see himself or herself as taking on, you know, Shoghi Effendi uses military metaphors, buckling the armor or whatever, forging, and he uses the battlefield. This is a spiritual fight, it really is. And to engage in that and to become a new kind of hero. I was reading a book long ago, which has stayed with me. It's by Ernest Becker, now dead. I think it was called The Birth and Death of Meaning. He also wrote another called The Denial of Death. And in it, he defines heroism as the ability to contain the maximum number of paradoxes. Think about that. to be able to embrace within yourself without cracking, without breaking, without splitting into either or, embracing into and instead of but, the maximum number of paradoxes. And I think that's really the kind of heroism, the elasticity, the broadness of heart that we're striving for. But to be able to distinguish, I think that's what your question is also about. How do you distinguish between, intrigue and ignorance and piety and abnegation, self-abnegation? To be able to kind of ask yourself, what are the opposites there? But it's a real invitation to sort of redefine ourselves as heroes of the modern day, stomping around looking very unheroic, doing very boring things. The heroism is invisible, it's on the inside. I don't know how to answer that question. It's a huge question. And it's one that every parent certainly feels and suffers from. And then you look back on your own life and you think, what a mess you've made of it, and what a lousy hero you've been. So who are you to tell anybody else what to do? But I think it comes back to recognizing that we're at the beginning of writing a new story, a new narrative. Yeah. Which is a new way of seeing oppositional thinking as well, which is what I wanted to concentrate on today. Not thinking in polarities. Beautiful quote. Are we going to read this and come to an end?
I think so. O
Go
people of Zion, if ye aid him not, God will assuredly assist him with the powers of earth and heaven, and sustain him with the hosts of the unseen through his command, be, and it is. The day is approaching when God will have, by an act of his will, raised up a race of men, the nature of which is inscrutable to all save God, the all-powerful, the self-subsisting. He shall purify them from the defilement of idle fancies and corrupt desires, shall lift them up to the heights of holiness, and shall cause them to manifest the signs of his sovereignty and might upon earth. Thus hath it been ordained by God, the all-glorious, the all-loving.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful quote. Thank you. Thank you.
I hope everyone here has a beautiful Sunday. It was a pleasure to have with us Miss Nakhjavani with us. Again, thank you for taking your time to expound upon these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful subjects. More than one subject, ironically. And again, thank you all for your beautiful input that you've put in today. Have a beautiful Sunday. We wish you a blessed Sunday.